What's interesting is the question, so were Naval's family aware of the fact that this name meant foolish when they named him? And did they name him in light of that? And does this sort of determine his character? Yeah. I don't think so. Naval, as a root in Semitic, not only has the sense foolish in Hebrew, but it also has the sense in some quarters noble. We have this attested in other Semitic languages, and entirely possible, and scholars have suggested this, that the name bestowers, Naval's parents, meant something like noble when it was named, but it has this nice correspondence with the current name foolish in Hebrew. And but what's interesting for your question about kind of God's role in all of this is what Abigail makes of it. She draws this correspondence, she observes this correspondence, and how this has all come together in this expression of Naval's character as foolish. She pulls it together in her explanation to David, and she says he is as his name. He is foolish.
Welcome to episode 2 of this series of the Tyndale House podcast. So it's great to have you with us, and I'm joined again by Caleb and George, Caleb Howard and George Heath-White, who are members of our Old Testament team. Caleb heads up the team, and George is a research associate.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And we're talking in this episode about the giving of names at birth in the Bible. We often think in our culture that our names are little more than labels, and yet when parents give their children names, they spend quite a bit of time thinking about it. They may decide on the basis of sound or whatever, but the meaning and the connotations, the associations of the names are still important. We don't get many, if any, children called Adolf since the end of the Second World War, because the associations of a name like that are pretty unwelcome in today's world. So Caleb, how did you go about choosing the names of your children?
I liked how they sounded.
Yeah, that was the same for us as well.
Yeah. So my oldest daughter is named Alexis. We just liked how that sounded. We knew someone whose sister was named Alexis. My middle child is Mariah. People often think she's named after Mariah Carey, the singer. She is not. And my youngest child is called Adele. People often think that she's named after the singer Adele. Even she kind of thinks that, but she isn't. We chose that name slightly before Adele became very famous. But yeah, we just like the sound of them. Yeah,
it was the same for us. So we have Charlie, Oliver, and Philip, who we tend to call Pip. And Charlie and Oliver, I suddenly realised we had both sides of the English Civil War covered. And then when we had the youngest, Pip, we tend to call him Pip because the landlord of a pub that Jane and I used to like visiting was known as Pip, and we thought it was quite fun. And then realised we've got a bit of a Charles Dickens connection because we've got, Oliver Twist, Pip from Great Expectations, and Dickens himself. It was all completely incidental. We didn't think about any of this. But of course, some people do put a lot of thought into the names of their children and what they mean. And we had a visitor here at Tyndale House recently, Adiola, and we were talking to Adiola about the naming of children in her culture. She's from a Yoruba background in Nigeria. It was quite fascinating, wasn't it? I can't remember how many names she said she had. I think it might have been 5. So if I recall correctly, and from other things I've picked up, so there's a name that's brought from heaven, which for Christian parents often reflects something to do with their Christian convictions, but traditionally it was a name that was divined by the elders of the tribe. And then there's a name that relates to the family, and there's a name for praising the child, and there's a name for that's more descriptive. And that happens in many cultures as well. I had a friend from Ghana called Kwadwo because he was born on Monday. And if you're born on Monday, you get called Kwadwo. So, yeah, it was fascinating. It was a very different kind of way of thinking about names from what I'm used to. And then the idea of a naming ceremony at 7 days, I think it is. And other people don't even know what the name is to be. And then parents, grandparents, elders, all contributing names at that point. It's quite fascinating. And it feels, to us Westerners, modern Westerners, that feels quite strange. But I imagine that's much closer to what was going on in the ancient world. How much do we know about how names were given in the ancient world and in the Bible in particular?
I mean, we probably all know the famous naming scenes you get, particularly in Genesis, but we get them in 1 Samuel, and the names of Hosea's, well, the unfortunate names of Hosea's children. So we have a few scenes, and then we get to the New Testament, obviously Jesus and John the Baptist. We have those few scenes, and what they all seem to have in common is this idea of a name being given sort of at or after the birth of the child. And often some sort of association of the name with the event that takes place. We don't have that many references to naming events that come from outside the Bible. We do have a few, I think, though.
We have a few, yes. They're very few. I wish we had more, right? And we have these stories in the Bible, and the question that might arise in our minds is, do they fit with the kind of Near Eastern context? Do these sorts of things actually occur in extra-biblical texts? And the answer, I think, is similar to a lot of kind of everyday realities that ancient people sort of experienced, lived out. They didn't feel the need to write them down necessarily. They were just things they did. Yeah. They knew what they were doing. Why would you write them down for posterity so that we can read them and find out about them? And so these kinds of things are inferred by us from texts. Often, if you have enough textual sources, if you have thousands and thousands of documents from the ancient world, occasionally someone will sort of slip up and talk about a thing that everyone knows. And this does, in fact, happen in a way in a letter from the first half of the second millennium BC. So from the 18th century BC, there's a king called Zimri-Lim at a city called Mari. And his daughter writes him a letter knowing that a child is to be born in the palace, and his daughter has had a dream about this daughter who's to be born and what her name should be. And I will quote the letter because it's very interesting. She writes to her father, "And concerning the daughter of Tepaum, who is the mother of the child, in my dream a man stood and said, 'The girl, the daughter of Tepaum, should be called Tagid Nawu.' He said this to me. Now my lord," that is Zimri-Lim, the king, "my lord should have a diviner confirm this, and if the dream was indeed seen, my lord should name the daughter Tagid Nawu. Thus she must be named." So Tagid Nawu means the steppe has been good, the steppe that is the countryside where you take your sheep, and the assumption is that these people were connected. We know that these people were quite connected to the pasturage. These people were often shepherds. And so claims about things around shepherding sheep and so on are not uncommon in names. And so it seems likely that this girl's name was connected to some reality that occurred perhaps in Zimri-Lim's kingdom or whatever. But here we have some insight into a child being born, and we can learn a number of things from this. One is that the name was being chosen presumably before the child was to be born, or at least around the time of the child's birth, which is a fairly common theme. We also have another document where an infant is talked about in a legal text, and I'll quote from that. It's from the same general period from Mesopotamia. The text reads, "In the month Abum, the 8th day of the year Samsu Ditana 5, that's a particular year, particular month, particular day in the Babylonian calendar, Amat Esheshi, in a new house of the street Nanaya, Amat Baba, her mother, bore her." So the idea is that Amat Esheshi is the child, the daughter, and Amat Baba is her mother. It's telling us that she's been born on this day, month of Abum, the 8th day of the year Samsu Ditana 5. And that matters as we read through the rest of the text. She, that is Amat Esheshi, the mother, is a female slave to Rutia, nun of Zababa, her mistress. With respect to Nanaya, she will meet her responsibility. The heart of Rutia, her lady, she will not provoke to anger. Now, the likelihood is that Rutia was a primary wife in a family, and she had been devoted to the deity Zababa. That's what's meant by her. She's a nun of Zababa, and therefore presumably could not bear children. This woman, Amat Baba, is probably a secondary wife, and she's brought forth Amat Esheshi to this man, and this has to be sort of worked out legally. How is this child supposed to be related to the family? And the text ends with a date, dating the function of the legal transaction going on here as month Abam, 8th day, year Samsuditana 5, the same date as it says that the child was born. And this shows us that the child was named on the day she was born, at least, if not beforehand.
Right.
So there's yet another kind of point of evidence that children were being named on the day that they were born. In one sense, this seems sort of obvious to us, I suppose, as a kind of practical necessity of needing a name for a child. But it's worth just recognizing how difficult it is to come by information like this. This is the sort of thing that people would have just known and done. And in this case, it rises to the surface of our evidence and we can see it.
Yeah.
I guess it's worth saying as well that we shouldn't, when we have these parallels, we have these few sources, we shouldn't necessarily infer, well, this is definitely how it was being done in Israel or at every period of Israel's history as well.
Right,
I mean, in the New Testament, John, people don't know his name until the 8th day when he's going to be given his name. So there is different things going on in different times and places.
Yeah. And even there, we don't know whether that was a normal thing, whether that was the standard expectation, or whether there was something unusual about nobody knowing.
Yeah.
I mean, that would certainly fit with what the Yoruba do by the sound of it, from what I'm understanding. That would be similar, but so it may well be. But we just, when there's little evidence, we have to be careful, don't we, that we don't infer too much from it. Yeah. So there's nothing that parallels that. Those things that you've just read, there's nothing that parallels that in the Bible, is there?
Well, I mean, in terms of kids being named around the birth event, there is. I mean, it seems that this is normally the case, that kids were named somehow in relation to either the conception, gestation, or birth of the child. This is suggested by evidence that I just read. We also have stories in the Bible which portray kids being named around that time and names being chosen. In the case of John and Jesus, the names had been chosen before the name was given. And the actual conferring of the name was around a key event in the child's life, namely the circumcision on the 8th day. Well, that presumably is a kind of context-specific, culture-specific phenomenon. Not everyone was necessarily circumcised outside of Israel and so on.
Right.
But another evidence that names were often related to conception, gestation, birth of the child and around the birth event is there in the meanings of the names. So a very common semantic category of name occurs when a name is a sentence. A divine name, a god or a goddess, is the subject of a verb. And the verb is to do with creating or birthing or providing and so on. So deity created or deity provided, deity nourished and so on.
Can you give us some examples of that? No, finish what you're saying first. Then.
Well, it seems likely that this kind of notion is kind of related to the birth event. So I don't know, a name like Ibni Eli, for example, my God built, my God created, is a fairly common kind of type of name in Akkadian, which is the language of Mesopotamia. But it's also kind of there all over the place in the Near East. This use of the verb make for a verb for make or create, along with a name for a deity.
Sort of giving names. Marduk has given a brother or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And have we got biblical examples of those?
I mean, yes. I mean, like, especially, most names that we find are sort of short sentences. Right. Yahweh has done this, or Yahweh has given, or that sort of thing. Yeah. So
you were saying in episode 1 that there's a shift in the pattern of names over time, so that the divine name is brought in increasingly. By the time we get to the later kings, it becomes a very standard thing, very common thing, and it's unusual early on. But is that same pattern of naming, but maybe without the divine name, is that same pattern seen earlier on, or is it a different pattern of naming in the early part of the Old Testament?
Yeah, so a number of patterns are there throughout the entire Bible and throughout the entirety of extra biblical within the whole scope of extra biblical text through time. So a pattern of name with a verb with a divine name is very common throughout biblical history and outside, inside the Bible and outside the Bible. There are ones that come in and go out of use, and they can correspond to the development of language, but they can also correspond to kind of other features as well. So I'm thinking of names that contain particular forms of verbs that mean one thing in earlier periods, but a different thing in later periods. And so in names, in an earlier period, we'll have the earlier period verb form, and in a later period, we'll have a later period verb form.
Okay.
There's a development in kind of how how names reflect language through time.
So the same meaning, but just it shows the development of the language. Yeah. Okay. Right.
Yeah.
I was reading about Moses this morning, and Moses and Aaron and their genealogy, and one of Aaron's children is Eliezer. God helps, or God is my helper, and that. So that's an example of the kind of thing that you're talking about, the divine, or a God and a God and a verb.
Yeah. I mean, that's not a verb. It's a noun.
Oh no,
right?
that's a noun. Yeah. No,
so Eliezer,
thank
right?
you for correcting my grammar.
No, that's all right. My helpful. God is a help, or something like that, a helper. I mean, I think that's an interesting case because Eli, my God, uses the common Semitic root for deity, but it's a term that can also refer to a specific deity in the Levant, in kind of Syria, Palestine. It can so there's a deity called El, and he's kind of the head of the Canaanite Levantine pantheon. And so whenever you see El in a name, it's difficult to know whether a particular deity is in view, or deity in general, God in general. Right. In the case of Eliezer, well, that's an interesting question, but it's just worth recognizing that there's a kind of ambiguity in that. So often names contain a specific deity, so Yahweh or Baal or Asherah or something like that, where it's much more clear. But this is debate actually in kind of name studies, right? When we have the name El, do we have generic deity? And can that be interpreted as a particular deity in the mind of the name bearer or the name user, the name bestower? Or does it need to be specifically the deity El?
I presume it's not possible to resolve a question like that. We can speculate that Aaron may have had a more generic sense of El rather than invoking this Canaanite god. But
we can speculate. That's about all we can do, right? So I think it's worth just recognizing that names and the meanings of names sort of are there in the minds of people who use them. And so it can be very difficult to access sort of what people thought about it, what people think about the meanings of names. We can sort of do our work and think about the etymologies of the names, but it's another matter to ask, what did this name mean to that person? And it's possible that through time, over time, names develop in kind of how they meant, what they meant to people. Yeah.
When we read the Old Testament and we see somebody's been given a name because of circumstances, or I can't think of an example off the top of my head now, and we're talking about names, and I should be able to think of lots of them. But somebody gives a name, and then a reason is given. Some of those reasons feel, well, frankly, a bit spurious. But so, to an English reader, what's going on there? I mean, clearly there are deeper meanings within the mind of a Hebrew speaker, and maybe sometimes it's to do with the sound. But why is it that some of these naming things just feel a little bit random to us?
I think part of the reason is, like what we were saying last time, that we don't get the translations of the names in our English Bibles. So if there is an obvious meaning, we're not given it. And part of the reason is because when we are given the explanation, even if we were to have them translated, it doesn't actually always fit exactly. I think that's what you mean when you say they're spurious. There's the connection between the explanation given and the meaning of the Hebrew name is not always quite there.
Yes. It's not apparent, rather. Yeah. I don't mean it is spurious. It just it feels it.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe a way to think about this is that we need to be careful about the expectations we carry with us when we read the Bible and its claims about these name connections. So we have very specific ideas about what we mean, or maybe we don't, but often we do, by what a name means. When we say, what does this name mean? We usually mean sort of, what is its etymology, which is to say, if we kind of trace the meaning of the word back to its original form or its original meaning, what was that? And that's there. That does matter for the Bible. Sometimes the Bible's naming scenes draw on that very clearly. So a good example of this is the naming of Manasseh. So Joseph, his father, names him Manasseh, Menashe, which is a PL participle. It means one who makes forget. And he explains that by saying, because God has made me forget all my trouble. And he uses a slightly different form of the same verb to mean essentially the same thing, right? So the same verb form, the same basic meaning, and the name means one who made forget. So it all sort of works. It's very nice. It's simple. And it is the sort of thing that we expect. But there are other names for which it's not so obvious that there's an etymological connection. Right. And so this becomes more difficult for us and more complicated. But it seems that it wasn't necessarily more complicated for them. They were fine with it. Okay. And so I think you yourself said that spurious isn't the best way to put it. But I think that's a helpful corrective. We need to all be careful in assuming that we know how this should be. And if the text doesn't do that, then it's doing it the wrong way. Probably we need to reverse that and assume the text is telling us something. We should try to pick that up.
To give an example, this is not how my name was chosen, but you could imagine a situation today where someone has a baby and say, oh, that baby's gorgeous, I'll call him George. And you could say, well, what's the connection there? George doesn't mean gorgeous. George means farmer, but they sound sort of vaguely similar. So, I have a gorgeous child, George. And so there's a connection being drawn between, they're gorgeous, I'll call them George. But there's no actual etymological connection between the meaning of the name and why they've given the name. Right. That's a random example that just popped in my mind.
Very nice. Yeah, as I've looked over kind of the different naming scenes in the Bible, I think it's better to talk about the relationship between the naming circumstances. So I've said it's the conception, gestation, or birth of the child, something around the circumstances of the child. I think it's better to characterize the relationship as a matter of correspondence between the name and the circumstances. And then within that, to sort of further define what sort of correspondence is in view. So Manasseh is a good example where the sound of the name, the lexeme, the particular word used, and also the meaning of the word are all nicely in correspondence across the board. Maybe a good kind of example where which is slightly different, but is still sort of within the bounds of what the Bible does, let's say, is the naming of Noah. So when Noah is named at the end of Genesis 5, Lamech, his father, says that his name is Noah, because this one will bring us rest from the ground that the Lord has cursed. Noah is related to a root nuach, to rest, in Hebrew. But the word nuach isn't used in the explanation. It's a different term for bringing rest. Right. Nacham.
Yes.
But you can still hear similar sounds. Yeah. There's still a semantic connection. And if you read enough of these, you get the sense that they don't feel the need to have this kind of neat set of correspondences, but one or two will do.
Right.
In other cases, it's a matter of maybe sound connections, as George has said. So if we open our view of what sort of might be there, in terms of the types of correspondences, I think we'll be better suited to read the text well.
Yeah, okay. That's very helpful. Can you give us some more concrete examples? Talk us through a few Old Testament names and show how these kinds of things are working out.
I think I introduced in the last episode, we talked about the name Samuel. So this is a good example of a number of things. So I mentioned the fact, I think, that the name Samuel, Shemuel, means name of God.
Yeah.
So we can talk a bit more about that. It would be worth it. The thing I observed is that Shemuel isn't related to the reason given for the naming, which turns on the term Sha'al, to ask, in Hannah's explanation in 1 Samuel 1. Sha'al, to ask, is repeated 5 times in the context as an explanation for the giving of the name. And what we said is that there are sound correspondences, not meaning correspondences. But it's also an interesting name for another reason, namely that the form of the name is actually quite old from a grammatical point of view. Shemu contains a case ending. The u, shemu, u, is a nominative case ending. So it contains this nominative case ending, which was something that was used in Hebrew, and the kind of family that Hebrew language is related to, much earlier than the language that we have in the Bible. So in the Bible, we don't normally find nominative case endings on nouns. We don't have any case endings normally. Yeah. But the name has preserved this really old feature. And so that's an example of how names can often preserve stages of a language, like a time capsule, and features of a language that have sort of worked themselves out. I also drew attention to the fact that that the term for Sha'al, for ask, Sha'ul, is connected to the name of Saul, the asked one, which is very interesting because Saul is the asked one by Israel. He's not the one asked for by God. Samuel is the one asked for by God, which is a very interesting connection to make.
So how do we understand how these things come together then? Because when you read through the books of Samuel, and you've got an irony there with Saul being the first king that the people are asking for, and this all fits together in a remarkable way. What is this? Is this the writer of Samuel reading back into the naming of Samuel to make that connection with Saul who's coming? Or is it? What else is going on? Why do these things work this way?
Well, you've served this up in a very interesting way. The way you answer that question will depend very much on whether you think there is a God and whether you think that he is involved in the universe.
It just might, man.
And the biblical writers think very, very much that God is involved in the universe. Mm-hmm. And I think that because what we would call the providence of God, that is the active involvement of God in history, is a fronted theme in the Bible. It's a very central theme in the Bible. So, for example, when in the Joseph story, Joseph's brothers come to him and they're afraid that he's going to turn against them after dad has died, Joseph says to them, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. So there's this notion very clearly in Joseph's mind, according to the story, that the development of the story is according to plan. And so I think that we can view names and naming as part of the writer's view of how the world normally works, that God is actually involved in the goings-on of history, and that the naming of figures like Samuel or like Saul and so on fit into that, and that what they are writing reflects that reality. Now, you may discount that. You may say that that's all nonsense, but the fact is it's there in the text for us to sort of observe. Yeah.
And that explains why some people's names seem to fit them so well. Joseph, since we've mentioned his naming his son Manasseh, but he adds, Joseph does quite a bit of adding, as well as adding to his father's family at the beginning. We'll come in the next episode. We'll talk about Jacob and his children and naming them. But,
If I can just say, there's a really nice example that I think pulls all of this together in the name Nabal, right? The husband of Abigail. You remember the story that David initiates a conversation with Nabal, who owns lots of flocks. He's a wealthy guy, and Nabal turns against David, and David gets really hacked off at him and wants to kill him. And Nabal is in danger. So Abigail, his wife, recognizes this, and she comes out with gifts and meets David and urges him not to do anything foolish, which is a very interesting thing because Nabal means foolish. And if you read the story of her explanation for all of this, she points out that Nabal, her husband, is as his name. He is foolish. He is Nabal. He's a foolish man. Interestingly, David is potentially about to do something foolish. She staves that off. And she's a remarkable woman. David recognizes this. And eventually, Nabal dies separately from David's agency, according to the text. What's interesting is the question, so were Naval's family aware of the fact that this name meant foolish when they named him? And did they name him in light of that? And does this sort of determine his character? Yeah. I don't think so. Naval, as a root in Semitic, not only has the sense foolish in Hebrew, but it also has the sense in some quarters noble. We have this attested in other Semitic languages, and entirely possible, and scholars have suggested this, that the name bestowers, Naval's parents, meant something like noble when it was named, but it has this nice correspondence with the current name foolish in Hebrew. And but what's interesting for your question about kind of God's role in all of this is what Abigail makes of it. She draws this correspondence, she observes this correspondence, and how this has all come together in this expression of Naval's character as foolish. She pulls it together in her explanation to David, and she says he is as his name. He is foolish. So I think she's probably well aware that the name can also mean noble and has that kind of significance, but she's also aware that there's this other connection, and she's happy to play with it. And I suspect others are as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, guys.